Have you ever stopped to think about where the meat you buy really comes from? It might seem like a strange, even uncomfortable question, but believe me, after hearing this story, you'll never look at your neighborhood butcher shop the same way again. Because for years, entire families in Seattle bought fresh, well-cut, carefully packaged meat from a man everyone considered exemplary. A polite, always smiling merchant known for calling customers by name and offering discounts to families with children. But what no one imagined is that behind that clean counter and that kind smile, there was something that could never be explained by reason, something that made the very floor of the butcher shop seem cursed. At first, everything seemed perfect. He was the kind of person who inspired confidence. He woke up early, cleaned the sign, sharpened his knives with precision, and let the scent of seasoning waft through the street. The local market depended on him. The ladies commented that the meat there was different, more tender, redder, with a flavor reminiscent of the old days. And he smiled, always smiled. No one ever suspected that this peculiar taste hid a truth so grotesque it would keep even the most seasoned investigator awake at night. His name spread as that of a good man, someone who was part of the community, who helped neighbors, who donated food to shelters. But as the years passed, small shadows began to appear among the praise. Disappearances began to be reported. Simple people, neighborhood residents, people who used to shop at the same place. First, there was a delivery man who never returned home. Then, a student who used to stop by the market on her way home from college. The police investigated, but nothing led anywhere. No bodies, no traces, only silence. Have you ever had that feeling that something isn't right, even when everything seems normal? That's exactly what some customers began to notice. A strange, unusual smell began to permeate the air. One employee commented on the freezer always being locked. Another said the boss would stay inside alone for hours, even after closing time. And still, no one dared to question him. After all, he was the good neighborhood butcher. And who would dare suspect someone like that? What you're about to discover may surprise you and perhaps make you uncomfortable. Because this story isn't just about a killer. It's about how appearances can be deceiving, how evil can disguise itself as routine, kindness, and normalcy. While everyone slept peacefully, believing the meat for dinner came from distant farms, the true horror lay there, behind the display case, lit by a yellowish bulb. And when the truth finally came out, it wasn't just the town that was shocked. It was the entire country. The headlines couldn't quite describe what had been found in that small butcher shop. The words human meat and local market had never appeared in the same sentence until that day. Stay with me until the end, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about crimes or investigations. It's about the darker side of human nature, the one that hides in plain sight. And it all started with a simple freezer, locked. Have you ever imagined living in a place where everyone knows each other, where the baker knows your children's names and the butcher always asks about your mother? Those quiet streets with children playing after school, smelling of fresh bread and freshly cut meat. That's exactly what a small neighborhood on the outskirts of Seattle was like. A piece of calm that seemed isolated from the chaos of the world. There, the local market was the heart of the community, and the man behind the counter, the butcher, was more than just a merchant. He was a friend, a familiar face, someone everyone trusted. His name was painted in red letters on the sign above the door, and the sound of the bell announcing new customers was almost a daily ritual. Everyone liked him, always. With a clean apron, an easy smile, and a kindness that seemed genuine. He knew each customer's favorite cut, prepared packages with care, and had a habit of saying, "Only top-quality meat here." People believed him. Why wouldn't they? No one imagined that, beneath that very counter, a secret was slowly festering, a secret that would transform the most ordinary place into a scene of pure horror. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now could completely change the way you see everyday life, For years, that butcher shop was synonymous with quality. Families lined up outside on Saturdays, and even those from neighboring neighborhoods came to buy there. The meat was succulent, fresh, with a peculiar aroma that many said was different, but delicious. Some even commented that they couldn't find a flavor like it anywhere else. No one imagined that this difference had an explanation, and that it was far from harmless. The neighborhood was safe. People left there, doors open, children walked alone to the corner to buy candy. And little by little, the butcher became a kind of father figure in the neighborhood. He offered meat on credit to those in need, helped with community events, and even sponsored the school soccer team. An exemplary man, a model citizen. But as they say, and perhaps you've experienced this yourself, sometimes evil doesn't lurk in the shadows. Sometimes he dons a white apron and smiles. It was around a harsh winter that the first rumors began to circulate. A delivery man had disappeared without a trace. Then a woman who lived alone was last seen shopping at the market. The police investigated, of course, but the clues were confusing. No one would ever associate the man who served meat to so many families with these strange disappearances. On the contrary, he even participated in the search, handing out flyers, offering help, and comforting neighbors. Have you ever been there? Have you ever trusted someone so much that you couldn't even suspect them, even if everything around you started to feel wrong? That's the kind of trust he inspired, a blind trust, built slowly, with kindness, friendliness, and a predictable routine. But behind the freezer and refrigerated cabinets, there was something else, something the scent of spices couldn't hide forever. The days passed, and the market continued operating normally. The conversations, the laughter, the sound of the grinder working, until one day, a customer commented on a metallic smell coming from the back, another on the disappearance of an employee, and although no one said it out loud, doubt began to spread, like a chill creeping in through a crack in a door. What was to come would make this quiet neighborhood a national headline. But before the horror could fully unfold, something even more frightening lay ahead. The discovery that sometimes the real monster doesn't live far away. It lives next door. And it all started with a simple complaint. About the smell coming from the freezer. Have you ever walked into a place and smelled something that just didn't make sense? That kind of odor that, even when you try to ignore it, seems to cling to your skin, following you even after you've left. That's exactly what some residents began to smell upon entering the neighborhood's most famous butcher shop. A metallic smell, too sweet to be ordinary blood, too heavy to be just beef. At first, no one wanted to comment. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe the freezer needed cleaning. After all, the owner was a respected man, and who would be bold enough to insinuate anything? But, as you'll see, evil rarely reveals itself all at once. It begins in small details, and this smell was the first. Customers began to whisper. Some complained about the aroma permeating the bags. Others said the meat tasted different, even though it was freshly cut. Maybe he changed suppliers, someone said, or it must be imported. And in a way, they were right, just not in the way they imagined. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you a lot. One afternoon, a woman who had been shopping there for over 10 years returned to the market to complain. She said the smell of the meat was unbearable when it started frying. The butcher overheard, laughed lightly, and assured her he would fix it. The next day, the smell seemed even stronger. That's when one of the employees, the youngest on the team, decided to open the freezer to see what was going on. He later recounted that the air inside was so thick it felt like it stuck in his throat. Among the blocks of meat, he noticed something different, oddly shaped cuts, pieces that didn't fit into any animal he knew. It wasn't beef, nor pork, he would later say. It was something else, but the fear of losing his job made him silent. He cleaned the floor, closed the lid, and pretended he hadn't seen anything. But his conscience kept him awake that night. Have you ever felt that? That feeling that if you stay silent, something worse will happen. The next morning, the smell was everywhere. It permeated the air, mixed with the scent of the spices the butcher used to mask the odors. Some customers even left before being served. The murmur spread through the neighborhood and soon reached the wrong ears. It was an anonymous call that changed everything. No one knows for sure who called, but the tip contained just one sentence: "You need to open the freezer at the supermarket." When the police arrived, the owner seemed calm, almost too calm. He greeted the officers and offered them coffee, feigning normalcy. The officers said it was just a routine inspection, but when they opened the freezer, the frozen air that escaped seemed to contain something denser than just cold. The smell, the one no one could explain, filled the room within seconds. One of the investigators covered his nose, took a step back, and fell silent. Inside the freezer, among the pieces of meat wrapped in thick plastic, was something that shouldn't have been there. Something that didn't look like anything a butcher would sell. And in that instant, silence fell over the shop. The butcher's smile faded. The customers outside watched the police officers leave with pale expressions, and soon the sound of sirens cut through the tranquility of the street. But what they found inside, that's what no one was prepared to see. And that's exactly where the real story begins. Have you ever imagined what would happen if the police walked into a seemingly ordinary place? A clean, organized neighborhood butcher shop, lit by white lights, and left completely silently, without saying a word. That's exactly what happened that cloudy morning in Seattle, when the patrol cars surrounded the small shop that for years had fed hundreds of families. Neighbors thought it was a simple inspection. Others, more curious, gathered on the sidewalk, trying to understand why so many officers were there. But as time passed, the officers' expressions changed. What was routine became something none of them would forget. Inside, the air was heavy. The familiar smell of raw meat and spices seemed different, heavier, sweeter, almost suffocating. The butcher's owner, wearing the same apron as always and with a serene expression, was watching everything closely. He said there was nothing wrong, that he was willing to cooperate. He spoke so calmly that for a moment he almost convinced everyone that this was just another misunderstanding, but what was about to be discovered would leave no room for doubt. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear now may make you doubt your own reality. The investigators split up. Two began searching the back of the store, another examined the counter and shelves, while the constant sound of refrigerators filled the silence, until one of them noticed something: a freezer locked with a large new padlock, unlike the others. The butcher hesitated for a second when questioned. He said he kept special cuts there, but his voice trembled, and in that instant, something changed in the air. The key was found in an apron pocket. The officer turned it, and the click of the padlock echoed through the room like a gunshot. Cold air slowly escaped, followed by a metallic, damp smell that was impossible to ignore. The officer held his breath and lifted the lid. What lay inside was unlike anything he had seen before. Carefully packaged pieces of meat stacked neatly, with labels attached to each package. But what caught his attention weren't the cuts. It was the names written on them. First, a woman's name, then another, and another. Each piece was labeled with simple, almost beautiful, but undeniably human handwriting. The officers exchanged glances, trying to understand. One of them backed away, the other remained motionless, unable to speak. The butcher's owner, however, remained serene, watching, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Can you imagine what you would feel if you were there? The sound of the freezer still open, the cold air touching the face, the mind trying to deny what the eyes saw. The samples were taken to the lab that same afternoon. The report would return days later, short to the point, devastating. The meat was human, every package without exception. The names belonged to people who had disappeared in recent years, residents of the same neighborhood, customers at the same market. The news spread like wildfire. The The smiling butcher, the one who donated meat at community events and helped families in need, had fed the entire town with the worst kind of horror. The streets were deserted, the doors were closed, and no one wanted to even pass by the building anymore. But the most disturbing thing wasn't what they found in the freezer. It was what they found, and that's what will leave you breathless, because what came next showed that the terror was far from over. Have you ever trusted someone so much that you couldn't even imagine what they were truly capable of? A firm handshake, a friendly smile, a calm look. Sometimes that's all it takes to lower our guard. And that's exactly how he won over an entire neighborhood. For years, the corner butcher was considered a model of hard work, punctual, polite, and well-liked by all. He knew families' names, asked about their children, offered personalized cuts of meat, and always made generous donations at local festivals. To the residents, he was the kind of man any community would want. But what no one knew is that behind that white apron and calloused hands lay a silent predator. His name was William Crane, and before he became known as the Seattle Butcher, he was just another shy, lonely boy with a childhood few understood. He grew up surrounded by screams and blood, in a home where the sound of a knife being sharpened was more common than laughter. His father, also a butcher, taught him from an early age how to handle meat, how to cut, weigh, and clean. But what for many would have been a profession became an obsession for him. The line between work and pleasure began to blur long before any crime was committed. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now might make you wonder how many people like this go unnoticed every day. Over time, William became what everyone called the perfect professional. Disciplined, methodical, incapable of making a mistake. His neighbors described him as reserved, but never rude. He worked from morning to night, rarely missing a day. Some saw him as a loner, others as a focused man. No one imagined that this dedication was actually part of a carefully constructed ritual. Investigators who later studied the case would say that William was a functional psychopath, someone able to blend seamlessly into society without arousing suspicion. He didn't kill out of anger or impulse. He killed out of necessity. He believed he was recycling human waste, a phrase he used with disturbing coldness in police interviews. He said many of his victims wouldn't be missed, that the world was full of useless people. This was how he justified the horror he caused. Have you ever heard someone speak so calmly about something monstrous that the silence becomes unbearable? It was like that during the interrogation. He showed no remorse. He didn't tremble. He didn't cry. He didn't try to defend himself. He simply explained as if he were describing a recipe. "The secret is to make it seem ordinary," he said. "People don't suspect what they see every day." Neighbors described the same serenity in the days before his arrest. They said he was the kind of man who offered to help carry bags, who would say good morning even to those who ignored him. A former customer said he once offered her a special cut of meat, carefully wrapped. She refused because she thought the price was too low. After the discovery of the freezer, she could never eat red meat again. Police, for their part, still wonder how many victims there actually were. The labels found on the packages contained names but also initials, numbers, and strange symbols. Some believe he followed a pattern, a sort of personal catalogue. Others believe it was all part of a ritual, a way to give his victims identities after removing them from the world. What's most shocking about this case isn't just the crime itself, but the coldness with which he lived among everyone, disguised as an ordinary man. And perhaps most frightening of all is realizing that evil sometimes doesn't scream. It smiles, it greets, it weighs the right meat and graciously hands over the change. And when the truth came out, it became clear that no one really knew William Crane, not even those who called him friend. Have you ever stopped to think about how the face of evil can sometimes look like anyone's? With a friendly neighbor, someone who greets you every morning, or even the man who sells meat at the corner market. That was the question that tormented an entire city when the William Crane trial began. The case that had shocked Seattle, the butcher who sold human flesh as if it were beef, finally reached the courts, and for the first time the public saw the face behind the horror. An ordinary face, calm, almost expressionless. When he entered the courtroom, wearing the same serene look he displayed behind the counter, the silence was absolute. Reporters crowded into chairs, cameras flashed like flashbulbs, and yet he walked calmly, as if none of it affected him. Some swore they saw a faint smile. Others said it was simply the natural expression of someone who had long since disconnected from reality. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may change your view of evil and how much we trust appearances. During the trial, every detail of the case came to light. The evidence was irrefutable. DNA samples confirmed that the meat sold at his butcher shop belonged to at least 11 people who disappeared between 2015 and 2021. The name tags, the falsified records, the altered receipts, everything pointed to a meticulous plan devised over the years. But what was most shocking was his behavior. William denied nothing. He spoke naturally, as if narrating the workings of a clock. "People waste what is most precious to them," he said in one of the hearings. "I simply gave new purpose to what the world had already forgotten." The public reacted with horror, but also with a strange fascination. How could someone so ordinary hide such monstrosity? This question echoed across the news, on social media, and in school hallways. The case became the subject of debates, documentaries, books, and podcasts. The Seattle Butcher, as he became known, became a symbol of what is most disturbing in human nature, the ability to appear normal while committing the unthinkable. Have you ever been there? Have you ever looked at someone and wondered what's really going on inside their head? William's neighbors began asking this question every day. Many confessed that after his arrest, they avoided leaving their homes. Some moved out of the neighborhood. Others simply stopped eating meat. The fear was no longer about the crime itself, but about the idea that he had lived among them for so long without arousing suspicion. During the trial, criminal psychology experts tried to understand his motivations. Some said he suffered from severe mental disorders. Others believed he was a narcissist who viewed his victims as raw material. One detail in particular stood out. During every interrogation, he referred to the people he killed in the plural as they, the meat, the cuts, as if he wasn't talking about human beings, but rather products. A complete, calculated and cold dehumanization. People were torn between disgust and curiosity. Films began to be written. Documentary series explored every detail of the case. And in a way, William achieved what he seemed to want from the beginning, to be remembered. Even behind bars, his story resonated, fueling the doubt that would never again leave Seattle alone. Do we truly know the people around us? The trial ended, but the fear remained. The cameras went out, the reporters left, but the feeling of distrust lingered in the air. And it was in this silence, after the verdict, that something even more disturbing began to emerge. Something that would make William Crane's case seem like just the beginning of a much larger story. Have you ever trusted someone so much that you never even imagined they could hide something terrible? Perhaps a neighbor, a co-worker, someone who seemed ordinary, calm, incapable of hurting a fly. That's how it began and how it ended. For years, William Crane sold meat like any other butcher. He served mothers, fathers, children. He greeted customers by name, knew each customer's favorite cut, and everyone saw him as a trustworthy man. But when the horror came to light, the neighborhood realized that trust came at a price, and that the price was far higher than anyone could have imagined. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now may make you look differently even at those around you. After the arrest, news spread like wildfire. Headlines dominated the newspapers. The Seattle butcher sold human meat. The people who bought from him wept in shock, feeling unwittingly complicit in a crime that defied comprehension. The trial was broadcast nationwide, and when William first appeared in court, wearing the beige prison uniform and sporting that same calm look he displayed behind the counter, many noticed something frightening. He didn't seem remorseful. As the judge read the charges, William kept a serene, almost bored expression. He didn't look away, didn't protest. He just watched. Across the room, the victims' families trembled with tears and anger, trying to understand why. The prosecutor described every detail, every piece of evidence, every name engraved on the labels of the meat found in his freezer. And yet, he remained motionless. When given the chance to speak, William simply said, "I served the city for years. Everyone came to me. I just gave back what the world gave me." Can you imagine hearing that live, coming from someone who, until recently, sold meat for your dinner? The sentence was swift. Life in prison without parole. But the real trial didn't end there. The city of Seattle never fully recovered. The market was closed and demolished months later, but the land remained abandoned. No one wanted to rebuild anything there. People said the place still clung to the smell of horror. Some neighbors reported hearing the sound of the freezer opening in the cold, early morning hours, even years after the crime. The case became a cultural phenomenon. Books were written, documentaries produced, and screenwriters vied for the rights to the story. And amid the morbid fame, one question remained. How many people like William still live among us, disguised as ordinary people? Newspapers of the time described the case as the shattering of suburban innocence, because it wasn't just about murder, it was about trust, about how evil can slowly infiltrate everyday life, smiling, serving, greeting, until it becomes part of the landscape. Have you ever been there? Have you ever looked at someone and wondered what they really are when no one is looking? This is the reflection the case left, a grim reminder that true horror rarely arrives screaming. It arrives silently, dressed in normality, offering help, delivering packages, looking you in the eye, and sometimes asking you to come back tomorrow. And it is in this silence between memory and fear that William Crane's story lives on. Not just as the butcher who sold human flesh, but as a portrait of the price we all pay for trusting too much. And the most disturbing thing is that he never said where he found his latest deliveries. And the most disturbing thing is to think that even after all these years, no one knows how many lives he actually took, nor how many people still walk around believing they really knew William Crane. The case isn't just a story about crime and horror, it's about us, about how much we trust, how much we ignore the signs, how much we believe that evil always has a different face than our own. And perhaps that's why these kinds of stories are so disturbing, because deep down they force us to look within and admit that we could have been one of those who bought meat at that counter. We could have walked by, smiled, said good morning, and moved on, never imagining what was happening behind the calm smile of an ordinary man. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what resonated most with this story. I want to know, what did you feel when you heard all this? Fear, curiosity, disbelief, or maybe like many people, you've also had that strange feeling that something wasn't right, but chose to ignore it. Your participation here is what keeps this channel going. When you comment, like, and subscribe, you're helping spread these stories, not just as entertainment, but as reflection. Because every like, every subscription is what keeps this community alive. People who, like you, want to understand the darker side of human nature. So, if you haven't already, like it now, subscribe, and activate the bell. Not only to follow the next case, but to be part of a space where mystery, empathy, and truth meet. And stay with me, because what comes next will reveal something that few have had the courage to investigate. For years, entire families in Seattle bought meat from a smiling butcher everyone knew by name. He was the kind of man who seemed to belong to the soul of the city. Kind, patient, always ready for a quick chat while carefully packing orders. People trusted him, perhaps more than they should have. The shop smelled of spices, of seasonings, of routine, and it was precisely this normality that made it all so frightening. The problem? That meat didn't come from animals. It all began so mundanely that no one would have noticed. A new cut here, a different flavor there, a texture that piqued curiosity. Some customers even praised the flavor, saying the meat seemed more alive, more succulent. The butcher smiled, shook his head, and said it was the secret to the marinade, which came from an old family recipe, and people believed him, because it's easier to trust than to doubt. It's more comfortable to pretend the world is simple, that appearances tell the truth. But evil doesn't scream, it whispers. And so, in silence, horror settled in that neighborhood. There was something almost hypnotic about the way he moved, the sound of the knife gliding over bone, the clink of metal, the precision of his gestures. He did it with such control, it felt choreographed. The children loved watching him work. They called him the meat magician, and he smiled at them while his gaze, behind his apron, remained blank. Some say evil is born of chaos. Others believe it builds slowly, fueled by loneliness and a lack of empathy. In William Crane's case, it seemed a mix of both. He grew up surrounded by blood, in a family of butchers, where the metallic smell of raw meat was a part of his childhood. He learned early on to cut, measure, clean, and transform a body into organized parts. But at some point this skill lost the line between work and desire. He began to see in people what he saw in animals: matter, structure, anatomy. And when humans stop seeing humanity in others, what remains is instinct, pure, cold, merciless. Some neighbors afterward confessed they'd always found something strange about him. It wasn't his behavior, it was his silence. A kind of calm that bordered on discomfort. Others said he seemed to observe too much, that his gaze was never one of curiosity, but rather calculation. One customer recalled once seeing William standing in front of the now-closed butcher shop, staring at his own reflection in the glass. He didn't smoke, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. He stood there for minutes, as if observing someone else. These small fragments, ignored for so long, became clues to a hidden truth. And the most disturbing thing is that, even when everything came to light, even after the freezer was opened and the horror was revealed, there were those who still refused to believe. He was a good man, they said. He would never do such a thing. It's almost as if the human mind has a defense mechanism against the impossible. Because accepting that evil can be right beside us, smiling, responding, helping, is admitting that no one is truly safe. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because William Crane's story isn't just about murder, it's about trust, about the fragility of perception, about how human beings are capable of constructing a facade so convincing that even the truth seems like a lie. He wore no masks, and perhaps that's why he fooled everyone. The true deception lay in his simplicity. The well-groomed beard, the clean apron, the gentle gaze, the kind of presence that makes us lower our guard. And when trust becomes a tool of manipulation, the most lethal danger of all arises, the one that disguises itself as normality. The Seattle neighborhood believed it was living ordinary. Days, families buying meat, children running through the streets, the butcher's doorbell ringing as it opened. But behind the scenes of this routine, a man was redefining the limits of the monstrous. He transformed the everyday into a stage. He transformed terror into work. He transformed the act of selling into a form of control. The repercussions of this case weren't limited to the newspapers. It changed the way people see the world, how they perceive others. This brought up the question, know. One wants to ask, to what extent do we know the people around us? How often do we pass by someone who carries within them something we could never have imagined? Some say evil is a flaw, a deviation, but perhaps it's part of human nature itself, simply dormant, waiting for a reason to awaken. And what William Crane did was awaken this collective fear. He showed that horror doesn't have to come from afar, nor from ancient legends. Sometimes it lives nearby, silently, hidden behind a counter, illuminated by white light. The Seattle butcher case is more than a crime. It's a mirror, a reminder that when we ignore our instincts and fail to question, we open the door for the unthinkable to happen before our eyes. And perhaps the most frightening thing isn't what he did, but what no one noticed. Comment here. That makes sense to me. There was something special about that neighborhood. Mornings began with the distant sound of seagulls and the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the windows. It was one of those places that seemed out of time, where everyone knew each other by name and the doors were rarely locked. Children rode their bikes down the street, the elderly tended their gardens, and on the main corner stood the beating heart of the neighborhood, William Crane's butcher shop. The red sign with its worn letters swayed slightly in the wind, and the metallic sound of the bell above the door was like a familiar invitation. No one passed by without greeting the owner, who always responded with the same serene smile, the one that conveyed security, trust, and a sense that everything was exactly as it should be. William had a way of interacting with people that seemed so natural. He didn't just sell meat, he told stories. He explained where each cut came from, talked about the farms, about caring for the animals, about the recipes his mother had taught him when he was still a boy. It was hard not to like him. His voice had a calm, almost hypnotic tone that made customers forget about the clock. And when he handed over the brown paper-wrapped package, he always finished with a bon appetit that felt more like a blessing than a farewell. For years, that butcher shop was the community's meeting place. Newlyweds would buy meat there for their first dinner together, and older families would secure special cuts for Sunday lunches. The smells wafting from the cold rooms mingled with the aroma of warm bread from the bakery next door, and there was something almost poetic about the routine of that block. It was as if time moved slowly, protected by a bubble of tranquility no one could have imagined to be so fragile. But behind the cozy facade, there were small, almost invisible signs that something wasn't quite right. A delivery driver once commented that William always prevented him from unloading in the back, saying he preferred to do it himself. Another noticed that the butcher spent more time in the freezer than at the counter. Some employees tried to question him, but were quickly dismissed with a smile and generous pay. "He's just a perfectionist," locals said. "He likes to do everything himself." This blind trust is what defines human behavior when routine becomes anesthetic. When everything seems normal, no one looks closely, and it was precisely this sense of normalcy that allowed horror to blossom silently. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what truly sustains the facade of normality is the collective mentality that evil is always something distant. People believe that monsters look like monsters. That danger comes from strangers, not from someone who greets you every morning. And it's this naive belief that creates the perfect conditions for tragedy. William Crane understood this better than anyone. He didn't need to hide, he just needed to fit in. There's a disturbing power in the way trust is built. It's based on small gestures, a smile, a greeting, a favor done at the right time. Little by little, this repetition creates an emotional bond, a subtle dependence. And when you realize it, you no longer question it, you believe. Because doubting requires energy. It requires confronting the discomfort of uncertainty. And almost no one wants to do that. While the neighborhood lived under this illusion of safety, something began to change. Isolated disappearances began to appear in the local news. A young man who worked nights and never returned home. A woman who used to stop there to buy meat after work. People felt sorry for him, of course, but never imagined it had anything to do with the place where they bought their dinner. It must have been a robbery, they said. The city's getting dangerous. The butcher, as always, listened silently. And the most disturbing thing is that even as the tension began to spread, he seemed unfazed. He continued to open the shop early, turning on the lights, sharpening the knives with the same care as always. Customers watched him, admiring. his dedication, unaware that they were witnessing a ritual. This is the cruelest part of the story, the way evil disguises itself as routine. True horror needs neither screams nor shadows, it only needs repetition, a common gesture performed every day until it becomes invisible. And that's how the Seattle Butcher built his empire of silence, an empire sustained by trust, ignorance, and the collective refusal to see what was right before everyone's eyes. Sometimes I wonder how much our minds are shaped by conventions. We believe in what's comfortable, ignore what threatens us, and call it stability. But stability can be an invisible prison, and in that neighborhood, that prison smelled of fresh meat and spices. The truth hidden behind William Crane's perfect facade wasn't revealed all at once. It seeped in slowly, like a whisper. Every glance, every rumor, every small detail began to erode the trust that sustained that community. And when the mask finally fell, everyone realized the transformation was complete, not just in him, but in everyone around him. Because evil doesn't just destroy, it contaminates. The journey that began with a simple purchase at the butcher shop turned into a collective moral collapse. The neighborhood was never the same again. People began locking their doors, avoiding conversations, and looking with suspicion even at familiar faces. The impact was profound, not only on security, but also on how people viewed the world. Trust had been shattered, and, with it, the illusion that they knew each other. Comment here. I'm on that journey too. It was an ordinary morning like so many others. The sun had barely risen when William opened the butcher shop door, letting the cold air escape the chambers. The bell tinkled with that familiar sound, and the routine began. Everything seemed the same. The smell of spices, the noise of the grinder, the line that formed early. But this week, something was different. No one could explain it. They could only feel it. An unease in the air, as if the atmosphere carried a silent tension, a whisper that could not be heard, only felt. The first to notice was a long-time customer. She walked in with the same smile as always, ordered her usual cuts, but hesitated as she took a deep breath. The smell was stronger. It wasn't the familiar aroma of fresh meat mixed with spices. It was something metallic, dense, that seemed to stick in the nostrils. "Maybe it's the freezer," she commented, laughing nervously. William simply responded calmly, saying that the seasonal heat made everything more intense. But something in his gaze didn't match the tone of his voice. Over the next few days, others began to notice it too. Some said the smell was coming from the floor, others swore it was coming from the back, near the locked door that no one saw open. A new employee even commented on strange cuts, irregularly shaped pieces of meat that didn't fit any known animal. When asked what they were, William coldly replied, "Learn to cut, not to question." That sentence echoed in the boy's head for days. He tried to ignore it, but the discomfort grew. Until one night, when he was in charge of closing the store, he heard a sound coming from the freezer. A soft noise, almost like something moving inside, the sound of metal scraping against metal. He considered opening it, but fear paralyzed him. He hurried out, locked the door, and vowed never to work alone again. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because that's precisely where true terror lies, not in what's seen, but in what's sensed. There's a fine line between intuition and denial, and human beings almost always choose the latter. It's easier to rationalize a fear than to face it. Easier to say, "It must be my imagination," than to admit something is wrong. This mindset of avoiding discomfort is what allows hidden truths to hide right before our eyes. And that's exactly what happened in that neighborhood. The feeling that something wasn't right began to spread like an invisible scent, seeping into conversations, glances, and subtext. People avoided talking about it directly, but the fear grew silently. Some customers began to switch markets. Others walked past the butcher shop and looked away. It was as if the city itself was trying to deny what their intuition already knew. But the truth always finds a way to emerge. And in this case, It came from where no one expected. An anonymous tip arrived at the police station one Tuesday morning. The voice on the other end was shaky, almost whispered. "You need to check the freezer at the butcher shop on Pine Street. It's not beef." The operator thought it was a prank, but the complainant's insistence made him take the message. The report only stated suspected irregularities in a food establishment. Meanwhile, William continued his routine. Unperturbed, he opened the butcher shop at the same time, greeted customers with the same courtesy. Normalcy was his armor. It was as if he knew the secret was safe, and perhaps it was up to that point. He trusted in people's disbelief, in the idea that no one would ever imagine something so absurd, and he was right. That Friday, the heat was stifling. The air seemed heavy. When the first vehicles pulled up in front of the butcher shop, the neighbors thought it was just a health inspection. William, calm as ever, welcomed them with a smile. "Of course they can come in. Everything's in order here." The sound of the key turning in the freezer padlock echoed throughout the store, a dry, sharp sound, like the prelude to something that could not be undone. The cold air escaped, bringing with it that same metallic smell, now stronger, more real, impossible to ignore. One of the officers covered his face, the other turned on a flashlight. Inside, blocks of meat wrapped in clear plastic stacked perfectly. Nothing seemed unusual until one of them noticed an almost imperceptible detail. Small labels. Glued to each package, the names were handwritten in beautiful, neat, almost affectionate script. Some were complete, others had only initials. A heavy silence fell over the room. No one moved. Time seemed to have stopped. William stood there, motionless, watching. No trace of fear, no sign of regret, just a blank stare that seemed to permeate everything and everyone. The police officer who opened the first package never slept properly again. He would say years later that, in that moment, he understood something about evil that he would never forget. True horror isn't the blood, it's the calm. It's the absolute control of someone who believes they're doing what must be done. And even after taking the freezer's contents for analysis, many still tried to convince themselves it wasn't what it seemed. "There must be some mistake," they said. "He couldn't do that." The human brain has an almost desperate need to deny the absurd, because to accept it would be to confront the fragility of reality itself. As the experts worked, word began to spread, first through the whispers of the curious, then through the headlines. William Crane's name ceased to be synonymous with trust and transformed into something darker, a symbol of everything people fear but never believe could happen near them. From that day forward, no one entered that butcher shop again. The doorbell never rang again. But to this day, some say that on certain warm nights, when the wind blows from the right direction, the same metallic smell still lingers over Pine Street, as if the past refuses to be forgotten. Comment here. That makes sense to me. The air inside the butcher shop seemed denser that morning. The temperature of the cold rooms battled with the heat coming from the street, and the noise of vehicles outside created an almost palpable tension. William Crane watched silently as the officers searched the premises, his expression impassive, as if this were just another routine visit. But there was something in his eyes, a calm that belied the gravity of the situation. It was the kind of serenity that came not from innocence, but from the certainty that there was nothing left to hide. The officers opened the main freezer. The sound of metal creaking echoed off the walls, and along with the click of the latch, the cold air escaped like a long-held sigh. One of the officers, accustomed to seeing the worst, took a step back. The smell that came from it was unmistakable, metallic, thick, too, sweet to be animal flesh. For a moment no one said anything. It was as if the room itself had stopped to listen to what the silence had to reveal. Inside the freezer, blocks of meat were stacked with surgical perfection. Each piece was wrapped in thick plastic and labeled with small white paper. The names, written in firm, round script, gave the scene an air of organized cruelty. They looked like product labels, cold, functional, impersonal. But they weren't. They were people's names. One of the Detectives tried to speak, but his voice faltered. The flashlight trembled in his hand, reflecting off the frozen surface. The second officer looked at William and asked, "What is this?" He replied, with the calmness of someone explaining a recipe. "Loyal customers deserve the best." It took endless seconds for the initial shock to turn into action. The team began removing the packages, one by one, and the sensation was that each new package revealed an invisible weight, a layer of horror that no police training could prepare for. Outside, curious onlookers gathered. People filmed, whispered, asked questions, but no one imagined what was being discovered inside. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the true impact of this scene wasn't just the crime itself, but the shattering of perception. The human mind tends to seek logic, to find explanations, but there are moments that defy even reason. Seeing human flesh treated as a commodity is like looking at the darkest face of human transformation, the one that completely eliminates empathy and transforms others into objects. The lab confirmed what was already obvious. The collected material was human flesh. The news swept through Seattle like a shockwave. Within hours, the name William Crane was on every television channel, on social media, in the newspapers. But what was most striking was the tone of the reports. No one could understand how something like this could happen without anyone noticing. How such a kind, respected man could feed entire families with horror. The case sparked an unhealthy curiosity among the population. People began to revisit their memories, trying to remember if they had bought meat at that butcher shop. Some kept receipts. Others swore they recognized a relative's name on the labels shown in the news reports. The city, which until then had lived under a sense of calm and routine, became the epicenter of a collective nightmare. The fear was no longer in the crime. It was in the doubt. And perhaps this is what most destroys the human mind, questioning what is real. Doubt is corrosive. It infiltrates thoughts, distorts memories, and erodes trust. And when fear takes this form, it ceases to be an emotion and becomes a mindset. The people of Seattle entered a state of silent paranoia. Eating ceased to be a trivial act. The smell of meat grilling in the kitchens became disturbing. The sound of knives cutting food seemed to echo differently. Meanwhile, William remained silent at the police station. The interrogations began that same day, and his coldness disconcerted the officers. There was no regret, no anger, no emotion, just short, direct answers. When asked about the names on the tags, he replied, "People deserve to be remembered." This phrase was repeated countless times in the reports, like a meaningless echo, but loaded with disturbing symbolism. The behind-the-scenes investigation revealed even more about his mindset. The diary found in his apartment contained detailed notes on each supply, with dates, descriptions, and in some cases personal comments. There was a kind of method to it all, a structure that blended rationality and delirium. What he saw as order, the world saw as insanity. But perhaps this is the most dangerous line in the human psyche, when individual logic disconnects from collective reality. Experts tried to find some psychological pattern that could justify such cruelty. Some believed William was driven by a kind of morbid curiosity. Others saw in him a desire for absolute control over life and death. The truth is that somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing human beings as sacred and began to see them as part of an experiment, a personal experiment in power, dominance, and impunity. The impact of all this went beyond crime. It changed the way people viewed the city, their daily lives, and their neighbors. Because when evil reveals itself this way, it leaves a scar on the collective psyche. And the scariest thing is that the more people tried to find answers, the more they realized there might not be any. The revelations continued. Forensic analysis indicated that some of the cuts had been manipulated with surgical precision, as if he had studied anatomy. This led the police to investigate William's past, and what they found only deepened the mystery. During his youth, he had worked briefly in a hospital, assisting in the autopsy department. He left without explanation, and since then, he avoided talking about that period. It seemed that everything he experienced there had transformed into something else, a kind of silent trigger that pushed him toward the abyss. Interviews with former employees revealed even darker details. Some recalled seeing him talking to himself in the back of the butcher shop. Others said they heard him muttering names as he cut meat, as if repeating a prayer. One employee recounted finding a child's necklace in a toolbox. When she asked about it, he simply replied, "It's none of your business." She resigned that same day. As the weeks passed, the case became more than a criminal investigation. It became a study in the limits of sanity, in how an individual can transition between normality and the abyss without anyone noticing. The hidden truth behind William Crane lay not only in the cold chambers, but in how he manipulated an entire city with kindness and precision. He understood human nature. He knew that fear is born of what seems safe, and it is this realization that makes the story even more disturbing. The horror wasn't hidden in dark alleys or unstable minds. It was disguised in everyday life, in the smiles of those who sell, in the simple gestures of those who serve. Comment here. That makes sense to me. The press spent weeks trying to answer the same question. Who, after all, was William Crane? How could such an ordinary man become one of the most disturbing criminals in recent history? The answer didn't come all at once. It emerged gradually in fragments of interviews, notes, and memories from those who knew him, and each new detail made the portrait even more difficult to comprehend. In ancient records, he appeared as an exemplary figure, an only child, raised by a strict father, also a butcher, and a silent mother who spent her days cleaning the same floor of their small house in Tacoma. From childhood, William was described as overly observant, the kind of boy who didn't join in the games, but instead closely observed others. Teachers called him intelligent but cold. He was good with numbers, but terrible with emotions. When his father died in a workplace accident, William was only 14. He was the one who cleaned the blood from the workshop floor before the police even arrived. No one understood why, but the boy himself explained, someone had to do it right. Over time, this sense of control became an obsession. Behind the scenes of his daily life, William seemed to move with a methodical, almost scientific mindset. Everything in his life was calculated, his schedules, his gestures, his manner of speaking. He believed that order could correct anything, even human nature. After his mother's death, he moved to Seattle and opened the butcher shop that would soon become famous. Neighbors remember how determined, almost obsessive he seemed. He arrived before everyone else, leaving after dark, always clean, always polite, always in control. But it was precisely this control that began to show cracks. Later investigations revealed that the first disappearances coincided with periods when William closed the butcher shop for renovations. Bank documents showed strange movements, deposits with unclear origins. Still, he never drew attention. He was invisible within his own routine, a master at appearing ordinary. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because understanding William Crane is understanding the workings of the human mind at its extremes. The line between sanity and monstrosity is thinner than it seems. And what's most frightening about this type of person is that they aren't born with obvious signs of evil. They are created. Every choice, every misinterpreted decision, every untreated trauma becomes a cog in a silent machine. William wasn't an explosive psychopath. He was a manipulator of perceptions, the kind of man who studied people's behavior as if he were reading an instruction manual. Forensic psychologists who analyzed the case described his mindset as rationally sick. He didn't kill for immediate pleasure. He killed out of conviction. He believed that humankind had become a corrupted species, incapable of valuing its own existence. In his words, found in a notebook during the search, he wrote, "The flesh is just the shell. What we do with it is our choice. This phrase in isolation seemed like a daydream, but in context it was a philosophy, distorted but coherent within his mind. The psychological profile drawn up by the police revealed traits of extreme narcissism, obsessive control, and a complete lack of empathy. He saw people as raw material. There was no hatred, no revenge, no explicit pleasure. There was only method, and perhaps this is the most terrifying aspect. Evil, devoid of emotion, the coldness that transforms atrocity into a daily task. Testimonies from former customers reinforced this paradox. They all described him as kind, almost too polite. A man who always remembered the names of his customers. Children who offered to help carry their bags, who wished them have a good weekend with apparent sincerity. The contrast between his public persona and the hidden predator was so stark that many simply refused to believe it. "It can't be him," neighbors said. "I knew him. He was good." But did they really? This is the great revelation behind William Crane's story, the way he manipulated the affection and trust of everyone around him. He didn't need to hide in the shadows because he discovered that the most effective disguise was the light of everyday life. His kindness was his armor, and the more people saw him as a good man, the freer he felt to act. A police officer involved in the investigation recounted something he never forgot. The problem wasn't what he did, it was the way he looked while he spoke. It was like talking to someone who doesn't recognize what's human. This observation was repeated among those who had direct contact with him. William's gaze was blank, but not aggressive, as if there was only calculation within him, an absolute absence of emotion. Behind the scenes of the trial, reports emerged that he kept a list of names in a notebook hidden behind the counter. Some were customers, others were people who worked nearby. Investigations never confirmed whether all the names were related to the victims, but the mere existence of the list was enough to reinforce the idea that he planned every move. None of the disappearances were random. Each choice had a purpose, timing, and method. And when psychiatrists tried to understand the motivation behind it all, they heard him utter one of the coldest sentences ever recorded in an interrogation. "People gave me the power to feed them. I simply used that power in the purest way possible." For him, crime was an extension of his philosophy of domination, a balancing act where he decided who was consumed and who remained. This twisted logic shocked even the most experienced professionals. One expert described the case as an autopsy of human empathy. William didn't just kill, he dismantled trust like someone cutting fabric. His every gesture seemed a display of control, an attempt to prove he could rewrite the rules of human coexistence. But there's a curious detail. Even among the experts, there were those who felt a strange, inverted empathy, a fascination with what he represented, the embodiment of a truth everyone prefers to deny, that evil can be elegant, polite, and functional, that it can serve smiles and deliver packages with both hands, that it can live next door, open the store at 7 in the morning, and greet the mailman. Over time, William Crane's name ceased to be simply that of a criminal. It became a symbol of something deeper, the failure of human perception. The case entered the studies of social behavior and collective manipulation, showing how blind trust is fertile ground for disguise. And the more people tried to understand his motivation, the more they realized that perhaps the answer lay in the mirror itself. Deep down, he was a reflection of what no one wants to admit: the fragility of morality, the ease with which good looks mask intentions, because the true monster rarely screams. He adapts, he observes, he understands what the other needs to hear, and delivers exactly that. William Crane didn't just fool a neighborhood. He exposed the invisible structure that sustains every society: trust. And when that structure breaks, what remains is doubt. A doubt that remains alive even years later, echoing in headlines, memories, and questions that will never be answered. Comment here. That makes sense to me. William Crane's trial became a national spectacle. Lines formed at the courthouse doors before sunrise, and journalists from across the country jostled for a spot in the few rows reserved for the press. Cameras, flashes, microphones, all pointed at the man who, until months ago, had been selling meat with a serene smile and a spotless apron. When he entered the courtroom for the first time, the silence was absolute. Not a scream, not a murmur. It was as if everyone was trying to decipher the same mystery, how such an ordinary man had become the face of such unthinkable horror. Witnesses described him differently, but there was a pattern: calm. William seemed oblivious to the gravity of it all. He listened to the accusations with his hands folded, his gaze fixed on some distant point, emotionless. When the prosecutor read the list of victims and showed them the photos, names and faces that had previously been just cold labels, nothing in him changed. Not a facial twitch, not a deep breath. It was as if he were watching someone else's story. This lack of reaction made everyone uncomfortable. Evil, when given a face, is far more frightening than anything imagined. The prosecutor described him as a man who turned confidence into a weapon and routine into a ritual. The defense, however, attempted to paint a portrait of insanity, claiming that William suffered from a complete disconnect between morality and reality. But his words, recorded during interrogation, dismantled any attempt at justification. "It's not madness if there's a method," he once said, "and I've always had a method." The statement made headlines the next day. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this trial wasn't just about crimes. It was about mindset, about how society reacts when the impossible happens before its eyes. The courtroom wasn't just a space of justice, it was a mirror. Every person sitting there, from the jurors to the journalists, carried the same silent doubt. Would I have noticed? Would I have noticed the different look, the cold gesture, the uncomfortable silence? This collective reflection transformed the case into something much bigger than a criminal investigation. It became a social journey, an open wound about the nature of trust. Behind the scenes, the lawyers reported that William seemed to thrive on the chaos around him. He didn't seek forgiveness or provoke hatred. He sought attention. As the testimony began, he observed every word with analytical interest, like someone evaluating an experiment. Former clients broke down on the witness stand, crying as they recounted years of buying meat from him. Some said they still had packages stored in the freezer, which they now couldn't bring themselves to open. This collective confession of guilt and revulsion gave the case an almost spiritual weight. It was as if the entire city were on trial along with him. Outside, the commotion only grew. Bookstores began selling special editions of newspapers, and TV channels broadcast the trial live. William's every gesture, every phrase, every look became a national debate. Psychologists, criminologists, and journalists constantly debated what he represented. And the more people talked about him, the more he seemed to grow, as if the horror itself gained strength from being observed. The days in court became repetitive: witnesses, evidence, reports, photos. But with each new detail, the absurdity became more real. One expert described how the cuts in the human flesh found in the butcher shop were expertly crafted. Another reported that, even months later, the freezers still retained an odor that was nearly impossible to erase. The prosecutor used these accounts to construct a relentless narrative. William was not a man out of control, but someone who had deliberately chosen to cross the line between the human and the unspeakable. The sentence seemed inevitable, but what struck the nation was the moment the judge asked if he had anything to say before the final decision. William stood, adjusted his beige prison uniform, and replied in the calm voice everyone knew, "I just gave the people what they asked for. Fresh, quality meat with a human touch." The entire room fell silent. It was impossible to tell if he was being ironic or sincere. Perhaps it was both. The sentence came hours later. Life in prison without parole. No reaction, no regrets, just the same serene look as always, as if the decision had already been written before the trial even began. But even behind bars, William Crane's impact was far from over. In the following weeks, Seattle went into emotional turmoil. The butcher shop was demolished, but the lot sat empty for years, untouched. Residents said no one wanted to build there, that the soil seemed contaminated by something unseen. People began to avoid the neighborhood. The market next door closed. The cafe across the street lost customers. The entire place became a symbol, a reminder that horror can dwell in routine. The cultural scene quickly transformed the case into a phenomenon. Books, documentaries, podcasts, films. Everyone wanted to understand what was going on inside William Crane's mind. Social media transformed him into an almost mythological figure. For some, a monster. For others, a symbol of the moral bankruptcy of modernity. The debate extended beyond crime and began to touch on broader themes: urban loneliness, everyday dehumanization, the price of blind trust. And perhaps this was the most frightening legacy of all, the fact that he left a mark on the collective mind. People began to look at each other differently. Distrust spread like a shadow. A simple gesture, like buying food or greeting a neighbor, carried a new weight. Fear had changed form. It was no longer fear of the dark or the unknown. It was fear of the known. In a sense, William got what he wanted. He became part of history, part of the conversation, part of the culture. A living reminder that monstrosity lies not only in the act, but in the reaction it provokes. Because in looking at him, everyone saw a piece of their own vulnerability, and that's why the case was never truly closed. Even after all the trials, books, and analyses, William Crane's face still looms large in the collective imagination. He's a reflection of modern fear, the kind born when we realize that evil doesn't lurk in the dark, but blends into normality, disguised as kindness, hidden in broad daylight. Comment here. That makes sense to me. For years he sold meat like any other butcher, and no one questioned it. He was just another man behind the counter with a clean apron, a kind smile, and a calm voice. People greeted him, made jokes, and shared banal stories as he weighed the cuts and tied the twine around the packages with almost artisanal precision. Everything about him exuded normalcy, and that was precisely what made it so frightening. Because evil, when it disguises itself as everyday life, doesn't need to hide. It simply exists. The William Crane case revealed an uncomfortable truth. Horror rarely arrives without warning. It seeps into small gestures, lurks in routine, feeds on trust. The city of Seattle learned this the hard way. After the trial, after the headlines, after the national outcry, silence filled the streets. It was a strange, heavy silence, as if the air carried a kind of memory no one wanted to relive. Neighbors stopped talking to each other. Doors began to be locked earlier, and the sense of community that once united the neighborhood slowly dissolved into distrust. The most profound transformation, however, wasn't physical, it was mental. Fear had changed the way people saw the world. A simple act like buying something from a stranger began to carry a psychological weight. The emotional impact of that case spread like an invisible stain. It didn't just destroy lives, it destroyed innocence, that almost childish belief that good people are really good. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what happened to William Crane is, in a way, a mirror of human nature itself. We build our security based on the appearance of things. We believe we recognize danger, that we would know evil if we saw it. But what if the truth is exactly the opposite? What if evil is not a monster lurking in the shadows, but a distorted reflection of what we consider normal? There's a fine line between what we call trust and what, in practice, is emotional blindness. People believed William because needed believe. He represented stability, routine, predictability, everything that makes the human brain feel safe. This is a basic psychological characteristic. Our mind prefers a comfortable lie to a disconcerting truth, and for years, this lie was served on steel trays, carefully packaged and carried home in paper bags. But the scariest thing of all is realizing that on some level, everyone contributed to the existence of this kind of monster. Every time they ignored their instincts, every time they chose not to see, they helped build the perfect disguise. This is the hidden truth behind crimes like these. Evil doesn't act alone. It relies on omission, naivete, and above all, on the human need to believe that horror always belongs to another reality, never to one's own. The cultural impact of the case was devastating. Books, films, and television series transformed William Crane into an almost symbolic figure, a portrait of coldness shrouded in humanity. He became a behavioral study, a topic of university debates, a reference for screenwriters seeking to understand what happens when empathy dies within someone. But deep down, none of these analyses brought comfort. On the contrary, the more people talked about him, the more uncomfortable the collective feeling became. Because this wasn't just a murderer, it was a revelation that evil can be elegant, polite, and invisible. In later interviews, some neighbors still refused to accept reality. They said he must be possessed, that something outside had influenced him. It's easier to believe in supernatural forces than to admit that evil can be entirely human. The town searched for an explanation that would alleviate the guilt, something that would justify the impossible, but the stark truth was too simple to bear. No one wanted to see what was right before their eyes. William Crane's journey from beloved butcher to convicted murderer wasn't just a tragedy. It was a lesson in perception, in the danger of appearances, in how small decisions shape collective destiny. Every ignored gesture, every silenced oddity, every metallic smell someone chose not to question, all of it created the perfect backdrop for horror to blossom. Behind the scenes of the human mind, there's a mechanism that protects emotional balance: denial. And it was William's greatest accomplice. Denial is the invisible shield we all carry, the same one that keeps us going even in the face of absurdity. But sometimes it exacts a high price, and that price is called truth. Because in the end, what the Seattle incident left wasn't just fear, it was reflection. The uncomfortable feeling that the world we've built rests on fragile threads of trust, that everything can seem stable until a simple detail breaks. The spell, a smell, a look, a gesture, and then reality shatters. Some experts say William Crane's case changed the way Americans approach the concept of home security. Others argue it was just another reminder that human beings are inherently unpredictable. But for those who lived through it, the impact was much more personal. It was as if, overnight, everyone had lost the ability to fully trust anyone, even within their own homes. And this is where the true horror lies. Not in the flesh, not in the cold chambers, not in the headlines, but in the mind, in the understanding that danger can be masked by kindness, that the monster can wear perfume, speak softly, and call you by name. This is the part most people prefer not to think about, because accepting this requires a profound transformation of mindset. It requires facing the fact that evil often comes not to destroy what is outside of us, but to reveal what was already broken within. William Crane wasn't just a criminal. He was a reflection of a society that values appearances and neglects essence. For years, he lived as a symbol of trust, and ironically, it was trust that gave him the power to act. The trust that nourishes, protects, and builds can also kill. And perhaps this is the price of trust, the constant risk of being betrayed by what we choose to believe. Because, in the end, evil doesn't need to scream to exist. Sometimes it just smiles and says, "Good morning, comment here." That makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because this story has captured your attention in some way, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps discomfort, or perhaps because deep down You also believe that understanding people's dark side helps us better see our true selves. It's this kind of reflection that drives this channel. Stories that aren't just about fear, but about the impact it leaves, about the decisions we make, about the hidden truth that exists within each of us. So, if this content resonated with you, made you think, question, or even give you goosebumps, leave a like. It's what shows that this kind of story needs to continue being told. And write in the comments, I'm with you until the end. So I know who has really walked with me this far, who hasn't blinked in the face of the truth. And if you want to continue this journey with me, there's a video right here that connects directly with this theme. A different story, but with the same atmosphere of mystery and revelation. Click and come with me, because what awaits you there may completely change the way you see what normal is.